Welcome to the World Cup mood board. The path to the finals. 99.94, Jarrod Kimber, all that sort of thing. Play the bumper, please. All right, let us start. Well, Pakistan were absolutely cruising in the last T20 World Cup until they weren't, of course. They were the only unbeaten team in the Super 12 stage, although to be fair, England perhaps, I wouldn't say gave their game to South Africa, but they clearly weren't trying quite as hard in that last game against Sri Lanka. But it was certainly England, not Sri Lanka, sorry, South Africa. Certainly England and Pakistan were the form teams at that stage, and then Pakistan went up in the semi-final against Australia, who was certainly not a form team. They were kind of all over the shop coming into that particular situation. If you go back and have a look at the entire tournament, Pakistan beat India by 10 wickets in what now seems like was 100 years ago, chasing 152, putting on 152 to beat India there. They had a pair of 5-wicket wins against New Zealand. Harris Ralph did quite well. And then the game against Afghanistan, where Asif Ali smashed 24, was it 4 sixes in an over? I think it wasn't in a row, was it? I think it was in an over. And then Pakistan were on a roll by that point. Bubba and Rizwan sent Namibia too many in a 45-run chase. And then Bubba and Shoaib Malik knocked out Pakistan's fastest. Baba got some runs, but Shoaib Malik made the fastest T20 International 50 from Pakistan against Scotland when they smashed them. 5 wins all the way through the tournament, and then none of that mattered in the next game. It's almost as if momentum isn't real. Anyway, that's for another time. Australia beat them by 5 wickets in the semi-final. I've got a whole video on that game and how interesting it is that went up recently, which is now completely out of date because of South Africa losing to Netherlands. But essentially, there was when they were 5 down Australia, they were in all sorts of trouble. They needed 81 off 41 or whatever it was, 46 actually, I think, at that stage. And Fakhar Zaman, I think in the video I said it could have been Asif Ali. It looks like it was Fakhar Zaman, was out on the boundary, was in the wrong position. Either they just didn't put him back on the rope, or there was a tactical reason they had him in off. Or he just wandered off, I should say. And the ball went over his head. Would have been caught if he'd been on the rope, or at least would have hit his hands if that was the case. Pakistan also batted a bit conservatively in that particular game. Although they do a lot. And that was it, right? It was an incredible tournament for Pakistan all the way through, pretty much until the 12th over mark of the semi-final. They were the best team in that competition. And then for 8 overs, they weren't, and Australia won. This time they started against India again because because the way we set up our tournaments is not fair and balanced, and we don't take things out of a ballot. We just make sure that India are playing Pakistan and probably Australia are playing England, and then we work around that as much as we can. Pakistan, of course, won that game. We're winning that game all the way through. 90,000 people in the MCG. They lost Bubba and Rizwan early, but then Iftikhar and Shan Masood batted really well to get them out of that hole. And then Shaheen Afridi slogged a couple at the end. They got what looked to be roughly enough, especially when India were 31 for 4. But Virat Kohli and Hardik Pandya put on a partnership together to keep their hopes alive. But even then, they were still a long way behind the rate. It left Pakistan in a seemingly comfortable position of having 48 runs to defend with 3 overs remaining. Then Kohli went berserk. And India took 17 from a fairly rusty-looking Shaheen Afridi at that stage. Next over, Harris Ralph had a couple of dot balls to start the over. I think it was 3 runs from the first 4 balls. And then there was the shot from Virat Kohli. Eventually, they needed 16 off the last over, of which 6 runs would come in extras, which is still one of my favorite facts of this World Cup. Nawaz, who was bowling medium pace instead of spin, got his Yorkers wrong, and by that I mean he kept bowling full tosses. There was no balls. Then there was Dinesh Karthik was stumped. They got the 3 runs off the free hit bowled which is still incredible. And Ashwin eventually winning the game after leaving a ball for a wide and then popping one back over the bowler's head at the end there. So at that stage, Pakistan had 1-1, lost 1. And if you've forgotten how cool that game was, it was actually a really cool game. It's just hasn't seemed as important because this tournament's had so many random highlights. But let's just have a look at the India-Pakistan highlights.
This swing. How close is top edge. This could be out. This is out.
In the next 8 overs or so.
Big. It might go the distance. Yes, it does. Long on is watching it sail.
Said to get more.
Now that is even closer. That is out. Right, this is a heave here. It's found a...
Well, it was a...
Oh, it's played on. The edge, and it...
Glove, yes. Run out, should be, fumble, could still be.
Kohli goes down the ground. Kohli goes out of the ground. Here's the first ball. It's a mishit. What have you got, Nawaz? Ashwin goes over. Clears the infield. India win a famous win.
So, Pakistan obviously at that stage had not won a game, and luckily for them, their next match was against the Zimbabwe. So that would be a perfect chance for them to get back on track. Everything seemed fine at the halfway point. Pakistan bowlers had enjoyed themselves on a very good, lively Perth wicket. They kept Zimbabwe to 130 for 8. Mohammad Wasim picked up 4 for 24. The only thing I would state that probably hasn't been talked about enough in that game is that that was a pitch that also should have very much helped the Zimbabwean bowlers, and did, although, maybe not quite in the way that we thought. But Baba and Rizwan failed again, and Shan Masood and Shadab Khan got things back to basically a run a ball from 40 balls left with a bunch of wickets in hand. And that's when Sikandar Raza struck. He took 2 in 1 over. Sorry, he took 2 in a row. He was on a hat-trick, wasn't he? And then in the next over, he had another one, and suddenly Pakistan was 94 for 6. And even then, they really still should have got home in that game. And with 10 needed from the final over, Mohammad Nawaz got it down to 3 needed from 3 balls. And, okay, wow. Let's play those highlights. These are even more fun than the last ones.
There's that short ball. Kajit! Turn it around in the airs. Bowled in this time. That's on edge. What a catch that is! First slip. Babar Azam takes one of the catches of the tournament. Gee, that's picked up. It's a long boundary. Oh, bowled! Squared up. Babar Azam. Bowled!
Got him, I think.
Not this. Could be another one.
Oh, God. It won't be, because...
Just a ridiculous game of cricket there towards the end. So at this stage, Pakistan had lost 2 games from 2, and they were out of the tournament. They did manage to beat the Dutch, restricting them to 91 before making far harder work of it than they needed to. And not only that, so they knocked it off at 13.5 overs to win by 6 wickets. But then Babar Azam afterwards was literally saying things along the lines of, he was saying things, wait, just let me shut my kids up. All right, let's see how quiet we make them from that. But yeah, so they did, they chased that total down of 91, but then Babar Azam was talking about how they didn't want to lose so many wickets, but they batted really slow as well. They just looked a completely muddled team. So they had 1 win from 2 losses at that stage. And of course, there was a bigger butterfly effect that happened with that particular moment. But we'll get to that later on. But I remember watching that game and thinking, they still don't look like they're particularly going anywhere here. It was very, very interesting that at that stage of the tournament, not only were they 1-2, but they were 1-2 in a way that the one hadn't even been that good. Then came Pakistan's best game of the tournament so far. Babar and Rizwan both failed, but Mohammad Harris announced himself from nowhere, smashing 28 from 11 balls. And then Iftikhar, again, the Australian specialist, and Shadab Khan took South Africa apart. This was Pakistan going full chaos mode. And you know, you had Harris's blast followed by Nawaz's cursed tournament. I was going to explain this, but we did make a video of it. And this is what Mohammad Nawaz's tournament was after four games. It's one of the worst starts to any World Cup I think I've ever seen a player have. I've seen failure before, not this. Play the Nawaz video, please. All starts with game one, India versus Pakistan. You may have heard of this game. At first, he gets smacked around everywhere, and so his captain tries to hide him. But then that doesn't work, as at the end, he needs to defend 16 runs from the final over. The plan is for him to bowl medium pace, which the last time he did in a serious way, he was 14 years old. So he bowls full tosses and wides, and he ends up losing the game from the final ball. Then he plays Zimbabwe, where he's not even expecting to bat. Pakistan collapse. He gets stuck at the wrong end for a while because of Muhammad Wasim swinging, but he finally gets the game to 3 runs needed from 3 balls, only to play it miss at 1 and be dismissed from the other one. Then he has to watch Shaheen Afridi get run out going for the tie. And then today, this was something very special. Tabraiz Shamsi hits him on the pad and he is given out LBW. But he also runs. No one knows why, because it's not his call. But while he's running, he also stares at the umpire. Because of all this, he is run out. So he leaves the field, probably thinking that the run out stands. But it doesn't, because the ball was dead once he was struck on the pad and the umpire thought he was out LBW. So he couldn't be run out, because he was LBW and the ball was completely dead. Now, had he stood around and asked any questions at all, he would have found this out. Instead, he left the field without reviewing his LBW because he thought he was run out. Had he stayed, he would have been given not out because he hit the absolute arse off the ball. Dude, your World Cup is cursed. Good news for Mohammad Nawaz fans of recent times, of course, he took a very important wicket against New Zealand. So he's still got the final to get through, but let's see how he goes. But Pakistan kept going. Iftikhar got his second 50 of the tournament. Shadab blasted one of his own. The second fastest T20 100 of all time. Probably must be behind that Shoaib Malik knock, unless there's another one in between I haven't seen. And South Africa's bowling and fielding went to pieces as the rain started to fall. So certainly, I think Shadab started South Africa's struggles, but the rain really cemented that. They ended up posting 185 for 9. South Africa never really got close. Shaheen and Shadab were stars with the ball, and once De Kock and Rasu were out pretty early on, there wasn't much of a chance. And then later, Shadab took 2 wickets in an over with Temba Bavuma in his best form of the tournament, and Aiden Markram. Eventually, the rain came again, but it just made it even harder for South Africa to win. So it meant that at that stage, Pakistan were 2-2. But let's just have a look at the highlights, because this probably was the best performance, all things considered, of Pakistan in this tournament.
Drag. That's close, very close. That's gone a long way up. Rabada back. Oh, in the air and gone. Yeah! Leg side. This should be taken. Number 8. And it goes straight up in the air. 3 of them try and get there. Now, will it be a team hat-trick? 3 and 3 ball. Gone straight up in the air. Pressure on the catch. Pressure. Well done. Oh, that's going to be out. That's going to be out. Same again. Pulled to the deep. Caught in the deep. Think about 2. It's slipped there. And they're not going to get home, I don't think. It's the long handle. It's gone a long way up. Will this be taken at deep mid-wicket? It should be taken. It is.
So they won that game quite easily. It should be pointed out that it's a weird game from a psychological point of view, right? Because it'd be easy for Pakistan at that stage to just kind of give that up because they really had no actual chance of making it through to the next round. Although they were there and thereabouts, I suppose, as far as a 1 to 5% chance of getting through. So from that perspective, Bangladesh could have upset some teams, and the rain, everything can happen. But it's interesting. If they haven't beaten South Africa, obviously they don't make it through to the finals. And South Africa were a very good team up until that game, really. And so it is worth looking at that from that perspective of that was a really, really interesting win. But for them to actually make the final, obviously other things needed to happen for them next. And they did beat Bangladesh. But before they beat Bangladesh, we're just going to play the video of the extremely strange set of events that actually allowed for Pakistan to make this final. No, Pakistan needed the Netherlands to beat South Africa to get to this stage. But let's go back before then. Baz the leader got hit in the face this tournament, and it was bad, really bad. And yes, it was against Pakistan. The leader at this point had been batting at number 3, but he didn't do that after he was hit. Netherlands changed their order and sent Tom Cooper up to that position. And it was batting there that Cooper hit 35 runs from 19 balls to stun South Africa. But the leader still played as a lower order batter and a bowler. And against South Africa, he took the important wicket of Heinrich Klaassen. So, had Haris Rauf hit the leader any softer, there's a chance he might have stayed up the order. If he hit him any harder, he might have given him concussion and he would not have been able to play against South Africa as a bowler. So what am I telling you? It's that Haris Rauf hit Baz the leader just hard enough to get him down the order and still bowling, and it's those two things that Netherlands used to beat South Africa and get Pakistan into the final of this tournament. We're through the looking glass here, people. Yeah, it still makes me laugh. I think my tweets about this are still probably getting shared by Pakistani fans as we speak. Netherlands upset South Africa. A lot of things went right in that game. Someone asked me on the channel and even on Twitter the day before, if Netherlands had a chance. A couple of Pakistani fans. I said, if they bat first and they make, anything over 135 with their bowling attack and the pressure of the situation on Pakistan, you only have to look at, we're talking about it later, but England against England against Sri Lanka as well. The pressure does sometimes play a part from that perspective. But everything went right for the Netherlands/Pakistan in that particular game. So that still meant that Pakistan had to beat Bangladesh. Remember, Bangladesh might not have been, Bangladesh have been an interesting side if you were to really go back step by step, through what they did in this tournament so far. They would have been a very interesting side to really get a good idea on. But they clearly are, probably I would say just below that level of where Sri Lanka are. So off the pace a little bit, but still good enough to, be a spoiler team. But they had a chance, if they had won this game, of going through to the semi-finals as well. And obviously that would have been a huge moment for there. And Pakistan started pretty poorly in this game. Bangladesh were 70 for 1 after 10 overs. And it looked like at that stage there was at least a chance that Bangladesh was going to put a lot of pressure on Pakistan in that game. But instead, Shadab again stood up. So you've got, 3 games off the top of my head? I'm trying to remember now. Yeah, I think 3 games. He actually bowled really well against Zimbabwe as well, although it didn't matter. And batted quite well against Zimbabwe as well. So you've got so many games where Shadab had stood up and really got them into a good position in that game. But he took 2 and 2, and one of those was Shakib Al Hassan, which was, to be fair, interesting umpiring. Third umpiring, I think is probably fair to say, involved in that one. And then Shaheen Afridi went through the tail. He took 4 for 22, and Bangladesh completely collapsed from a position where they had, I don't know, what would you say, a 40% chance of going through to that semi-final. They ended up making 127. And Bubba and Rizwan made 50 in the chase. Very slow 50, but even so. And then another exciting Mohammed Harris knock, and then Shah Masood played exactly the role that sort of Pakistan wanted to, and they went through. New Zealand's consistency probably saw them into that game as a slight favourites. It was, they had a very good tournament, but they had, of course, lost to England of recent times. Shaheen Afridi got Finn Allen out in that first over, and realistically, from then on in, New Zealand just struggled. They struggled with the bowlers and the pitch and the combination of both. Daryl Mitchell was the only person who looked like he could strike a boundary after Finn Allen was dismissed. And he made 53 from 35. But Pakistan were really good in the field with the ball and just fielding. And the run out of Devon Conway was obviously quite important as well. Pakistan had to chase 153. Babar and Rizwan fired, got their 100-run partnership. They're third in the last 2 World Cups. I think that's right. And then Mohammad Harris teed off a little bit more. Although, to be fair, he found it hard to get the ball away for a while. But Pakistan won easily. You could see how if New Zealand had played slightly better, an extra 15 runs would have made that game a little bit more interesting. But Pakistan were in the final. So that is the end of the Pakistan portion of our show. So we'll move on to England here. Muku, if you can play an ad break, and then we'll get back to the next part.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right, let's get on to England. So just like last World Cup, England were absolutely on fire going into the semi-finals, but they got done over by New Zealand, in a slightly less exciting game than the Australia-Pakistan one was. They didn't go unbeaten in the group stage, as I mentioned earlier, but they absolutely tore West Indies up early on. They bowled them out for 55. Adil Rashid took, 4 for 2? Is that right? I think that's right. Bangladesh were smashed as well. They made 124. Tamal Mills took wickets there, and Jason Roy made 61 off not many balls. They won with about 6 overs to spare. Then they played the eventual champions, Australia, and obliterated them. They obliterated Australia so much, Australia didn't really have a strong plan going into that World Cup, and then they tore up the actual plan that they had because England beat them so easily. They were all out for 125. Chris Jordan took 3 for, and Butler smashed 71 from 32. That was an absolute brutal game. And then 100 and wickets from Moeen Ali, Rashid Khan, and Jordan saw them beat Sri Lanka as well. But that was the game that Tamal Mills got injured in. England then, they lost that game against South Africa. Arasi made 94 and Rabada took a hat-trick. But realistically, it was, I do feel England were probably playing that one in 4th gear, if we're being honest. Then Roy got injured in that game as well. In the semi-final, New Zealand needed 57 from the final 4 overs, but Jimmy Neesham and Daryl Mitchell it was a I don't know, is it drab game the best way of putting it? It was just it didn't quite have the tension or the excitement of the Australia-Pakistan game, and then in the last 4 overs it looked like New Zealand were out of the tournament, and Neesham and mostly Mitchell, who batted all the way through the innings, suddenly came good. He made 72 from 42. And they ended up winning with an over to spare. I think both the finals actually were won with an over to spare, despite the fact that at one stage the 2 in-form teams who were bowling were in front. The story out of that World Cup was really a lot about death bowling. But to be fair, by the end of the tournament, they didn't have many of their death bowlers left. So, due to injuries and everything else, they really did struggle in that one, England. Have come through to this tournament. It's really weird thinking back on England in this tournament so far that, they beat Afghanistan by 5 wickets. They bowled them out for 112. Sam Curran took 5 for 10 at the death, mostly, I think. Took about 4 of those at the death anyway. They weren't particularly batting brilliantly in that chase, though. They were fine, and they won easily. They went into the next game and they played Ireland, and it was rain affected, but Ireland outplayed England kind of in every way. And most importantly, I thought they outthought them. Also, it looked like in that particular game, you could see the difference between hitters and batters. And that happened to be a game where perhaps you needed more batting. And, Balbirnie, being that kind of player, made 62 from 47. Chris Woakes got spanked around everywhere. Then with the bat, England lost wickets to Josh Little, and they were behind the rate from that point onwards. They ended up losing by 5 runs on DLS. So that was the first game of their Melbourne trip, and the next game of the Melbourne trip was against Australia, and that was a washout. So they went to Melbourne, and they ended up with a single point where they would have thought minimum they would have got 2, and were obviously probably aiming for the full, they would have gone into the game against Australia as very near as favourites, I would have thought, after Australia had lost to New Zealand. Doesn't mean they would have beaten them. But yeah, it wasn't particularly good. It just meant that after 3 games, we really didn't know anything about England in this tournament. They were just there. And, there was a lot was being spoken about Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Pakistan, India at that stage. And of the big 6 teams, England was the one that probably got the least press just because we hadn't seen that much. Even the game against Ireland, you could read whatever you wanted into it, but it was a particular kind of game that probably wasn't going to come up a lot. So, and they were only 5 runs behind in the DLS and all that sort of thing. So it was very interesting at that stage how we were looking at that team. So then they went on to play against New Zealand, and the batting first. That was the first time we saw Butler and Hales do their thing. I wouldn't say that they were completely smashing it everywhere. Hales was out in the 11th over. He made 52 or 40. Butler was chipping the ball around a little bit for him. He ended up, though, with 73 from 47. So he really caught up towards the back end there. But they were the only 2 that really made any runs. England tried to kick on with their middle order, and it didn't work. They made 179 for 6, which seemed like a perfectly good score on that pitch. And New Zealand maybe gave England a slight scare, but came up 20 runs short. Glenn Phillips batted very well, but they were hamstrung by Kane Williamson's knock. Stokes got rid of Williamson before Mark Wood, who has bowled, is it 25 deliveries over 150 kilometers an hour? Or 25 over 90 miles an hour? Whatever the mark is, he's bowled faster than we've probably seen anyone bowl consistently in a T20 tournament like this before. But he did very well against Neesham in that matchup, where Neesham just looked like, there's fast bowling and then there's Mark Wood. Sam Curran bowled well at the death again. There's a whole video I've made about Sam Curran bowling at the death, where I do bring up the Ben Stokes incident 6 years previous. It's worth having a look at. I thought it was a pretty good performance by England, all things considered, and it meant that they just needed a win against Sri Lanka to get through. If they had lost that, Australia would have gone through to the semi-finals, and it'd be interesting to see what the narrative would have been between the 2 teams, because Australia would have played exactly the same amount. Think about this: if Australia had gone through to the semi-finals, would people be calling them un-Australian? Probably not. Anyway, no team had won yet chasing at the SCG, and Sri Lanka bat first on that. And there was, obviously there was something in the whole thing with Chris Silverwood being England's former coach, and now being the coach of Sri Lanka. And, as Charlie is always happy to mention, that Chris Silverwood has the worst memories of Australia of any man ever. Sri Lanka started really well. Nasanka made 67 from 45, but on a used pitch, it was harder to score in the back end. And we saw some unexpectedly good bowling from England as well, to be fair, but Sri Lanka did fail pretty badly. Adil Rashid was excellent. He went at 4 and over and picked up his first wicket of the tournament in that game. It's kind of an interesting fact. I'm positive he had a drop catch in the game before, but Wood and Curran were excellent at the death in current. Wait, let me just tell my kids to shut up again. Yeah, and so Sri Lanka ended up with 141. England knew how important it was to score runs early on, and they did make a good start. Both the openers went in the 10th over, and by that stage, scoring on that pitch became fairly tricky. Dawid Malan couldn't bat as well, so they were they were the kind of batter you probably needed on that wicket down. Of all the players that you probably in that particular game you didn't want to get injured, it would be Malan. So Ben Stokes played the Malan innings. He made 42 from 36, and he got England to a 4-wicket win with 2 balls to spare. It was gritty, grimy sort of thing, and it did look like at a certain point that England might have balls that game up. But having said that, there's been a lot of talk about how Ben Stokes doesn't quite fit into this English team and everything else. That was the kind of the innings that he was picked for. And I thought when he was out of the T20 team with his mental health problems and his injuries and everything else, and people were questioning him, I always thought that he had the ability to play those Malan innings. Plus, of course, he can do things that Malan can't do in the field and with the bat. So, with the ball. So I think it was fairly normal at that point. Think about, though, where the tournament was at this stage for England. They'd limped home against the so-so injured Sri Lanka team. They lost to Ireland, where they were outplayed and outthought. They beat Afghanistan so early on that people barely remembered it. And their best win was still over New Zealand. If India had rolled them in their chase, would anyone have been that surprised? They just weren't really part of the conversation at that point. And it is, part of the reason I mention these things is that could have happened. We saw a one-off game where suddenly the narrative was that England was here and India was here. Whereas if you look at the entirety of the 2 World Cups, there obviously isn't that much difference between those sides. And, something could have gone right for England and for India, and those things sort of could have happened. In the same way, as I said, they went within 2 balls of losing to Sri Lanka, England. And what would the narrative be about Australia if that had been the case? All those things are fair. So if we go on to the Indian game, England just absolutely smashed them in the face, beating them by 10 wickets. They were excellent with the ball first up, sending India in, squeezing them in the power play in the middle overs. It's hard to tell how much of this was, I suppose, Rohit's form, because he seemed to be the player who was struggling the most. How much it was India chipping the ball around. But I do think England did very well. I think the period I thought they did very well was that 8 to 13 over mark, where they certainly kept pressure on India. They took a couple of wickets in that area. It meant that India went below a run a ball for, 6 overs, I think. And also it was probably the first time where Adil Rashid, he played well against Sri Lanka as well, didn't he? But, him getting the wicket of Sky, I think really changed the Indian innings at that stage, because Sky had been the major impetus for them through those middle overs. In fact, I think they'd had a decent record in the middle overs all the way through the tournament, and it was pretty much when Sky had gone in. Having been pretty excellent at the death all the way through the tournament, England were less successful with Hardik Pandya, but they did get Kohli before he began his catch-up. And so it meant that Kohli and Rohit, between them, chewed up quite a lot of balls for a very low strike rate. And India made it to 168, which, I think a lot of people at the halfway point were saying it was around par. It was hard to tell at times, because there were, the one thing that I thought was a good sign for England was the way that Hardik batted at the end, because the ball did seem to be coming on quite well. But it was hard to tell earlier on in that particular game, because Rohit kept using the toe of his bat, and when Hardik first came in, he couldn't middle anything off the spinners. So it did look like it might have been a worse wicket than it was, but it wasn't. It wasn't when England were batting on it. Hales continued his excellent tournament. He smashed 86 from 47. Butler weirdly ended up with 80 from 49 and felt like a supporting role. But they absolutely smashed it. Hales 7 sixes was as many as India scored in their entire innings. And England won with 4 overs to spare. And they probably, if they wanted to, could have gone even harder. And Butler won that game with a 6 at the end. I think one thing that, you go through all this and you do realize, when I talk about the randomness of these events, there is absolutely no doubt that England and Pakistan are not in the same form as they were in the first part of the tournament last time. But in some ways, I think it's been slightly better. If you look at Pakistan, they had to fight through adversity. They had to beat Bangladesh at the end after Bangladesh got a good start as well. And if you look at what England did in their game, and you look at what South Africa did in their game, depending on who you're playing against, it's very, it's easy when you need to win to not win, if that makes sense. So I do think that in some ways, I think Pakistan's overall form has been slightly better than England's. But it's obviously been patchy. When they've looked at their absolute best, they've been outstanding. But, the Zimbabwe loss, the India loss specifically, where, 2 games where and even the Netherlands win, there's a lot of patchiness throughout what they've done. Even the New Zealand game at times, I felt that should have probably been a more comfortable win than it was. But I like the fact that they've been very, very tested. I'm more than happy to say that I cannot wait for this game to get down to the last over to see Mohamed Nawaz bowling again. And then from an England perspective, I'm not sure they've quite been tested as much just because of the washout. And so they hadn't had to go through that. But if you have a look at their form at the start of the tournament compared to their form in the last 3 games of the tournament, they certainly look like they've progressed in the way that you would want a team, to be understanding what they're doing. They've got some players like Ben Stokes and Sam Curran playing, new roles, which is probably not what they would have wanted, a couple of months, a year ago when they were planning for this tournament. But that's a situation that they've had. But I would say over the 2 tournaments, these have been the best 2 teams. So I'm very glad that they've both made it to a final. Because if they hadn't, I think people would be saying that they had done something wrong. And I think they're both playing to their strengths, even if, there are parts of both of their games that I think they could do differently. Onto the pitch. It will be used again for the final. I slagged off the ICC the other day. It's worth bringing Cricket Australia into this as well. Australia's had some bad luck with rain in this tournament, but part of the reason that it has rained more in this tournament is because they are playing it out of season, right? This is not the Australian summer. And from that perspective, yes, you could say that whatever it was in Melbourne in October had triple its normal rain. That is an element of fluke. But Australia doesn't want to give up their summer, so they're playing outside of summer, so they have to take a portion of that. The other one is that they're not producing fresh pitches for finals. Like, what? Why? Why would they do that? It just doesn't. For me, it doesn't make any sense at all. We've now had 3 finals in Australia at 3 different grounds, and every one of them is being reused. These are the most important games being played in cricket this year. Just roll a new pitch. I really think that is horrible. So I think that while the ICC obviously should shoulder a lot of the blame, and you can see, we talked about it quite a bit the other day. Cricket Australia have to play a part here. There's no reason for any cricket nation in the world to be hosting a World Cup and not having a fresh pitch for a final. Semi-finals still annoys me, but a final, come on now. So we've seen 2 knockout games on the used wickets so far. Sydney behaved a little bit like it was a dog toy dragged out from under the shed. Adelaide, I thought, considering that they used that pitch twice, I thought that wicket came up really nicely in that particular game. I think that if you look at the MCG, it's obviously a pitch I know pretty well. I think a more traditional early season Melbourne wicket would definitely have helped Pakistan. Sometimes you get even more tennis ball bounce early in the year, but also it's just that the ball nips around off the wicket a little bit. And weirdly enough, Pakistan is the team with batting and bowling set up better than England is from that perspective. If you look at the more big bash wickets that you've seen, I think that kind of a wicket would have helped England a little bit more. That, obviously a little bit flatter and quite even when it comes to the bounce. I don't think either of those wickets is what we're going to see. I'm not 100% sure what is going to happen. It looks like it feels like the curators now had enough time without the rain to be able to get the wicket to the level that they would want it to be. But there is still a lot of rain forecast over, the next 24 hours or so, or 18 hours, whenever the game is starting. So that could change quite a bit. And we don't really know. I think this is, we're not 100% sure how the wickets will go from a reuse perspective, because the earlier wickets that had been reused were produced when it was, a monsoon, and the rain has stopped then. So it'd be interesting to see exactly what we're going to see from that perspective, whether it behaves more like that SCG pitch, which was a more traditional used pitch, or the Adelaide one. From that perspective, it's almost impossible to work out which way it's going to go. But if you look at the ground, I think the bigger boundaries should help Pakistan, because they have more strike rotators and it will make their bowlers slightly more potent. But Mark Wood and Sam Curran have been banging the ball in quite a lot short in this tournament, which is certainly a good play on the MGG's huge square boundaries. So that will be an interesting part of that. Not that it really matters if the MCG is underwater for 2 days. If that does happen, and the game ends up getting shortened, I think that's an advantage for England, because I think they just have so much more power available to them than Pakistan. And also Pakistan's main strength as a T20 team is taking wickets, and that's not going to be a big issue. So in a 10 over game, or a 14 over game, or a 7 over game, whatever we get to. So that's basically how I see the conditions, and that's the teams as they have come in. We'll take a short break here, and then I'll come back and I'll do a couple of questions, and then I'll see you tomorrow.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app, and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
All right, let's get to some questions. Our Earth is the best, says, who is Curran the best, or is Curran the best left armer at the moment? I think this is a recency bias question. I mean, Curran basically, before this tournament, wasn't a particularly above average T20 bowler. So we've seen him bowl 6 times. No, there's a washout 5 times, and suddenly he's gone from nowhere to the world's best. I mean, Shahid Afridi is still in this tournament, so he's obviously the best left armer. But there's a lot of good left armers around. You've got players like Obed McCoy who've been bowling better than Curran for a long period of time. You've obviously still got Trent Bolt available. I'm trying to think of some of the others. I'm sure I'm missing some obvious. I mean, Arshdeep Singh was a very good bowler. Curran has found a method that has worked in this World Cup of recent times. If you're more interested in Curran, it is worth having a look at the video I made about him and death bowling, because I do think he's made some really interesting changes, but I don't think he's suddenly become the world's best left-arm bowler because of 5 games. Nish says, do you think the Asian sides have played too conservatively this World Cup? I think... No, because I don't think it's just them. I think you would probably throw South Africa and New Zealand in there as well. I think that Australia, West Indies, and England are probably the only 3 teams playing in that sort of modern hitting style of T20 cricket. Even a team like Scotland, who kind of had their rise doing that, doesn't do that anymore. I'm trying to think if there's any other smaller nations that kind of do that. Oh, I suppose Afghanistan would be the other team as well. So it'd be Afghanistan would have been the other team, and then maybe Scotland a few years ago, but maybe not so much the way they're playing their T20 cricket now. I think what you have is you have the teams who are willing to hit a lot of boundaries and take a lot of risks, and then you have all the other teams. So, New Zealand, South Africa, both, by number 7, you're talking about Wayne Parnell and Santner. So, and then a similar sort of situation with India, similar sort of situation with Pakistan. They're probably hoping Mohammad Wasim becomes an all-rounder, which would allow them to go a little bit stronger at the front. And then Sri Lanka is just doesn't really have any power hitters, and Bangladesh traditionally has never had any power hitters. So I just think that there's a few sides playing that method. At a certain point, you've got to go with your strength. So when you say conservative, they're not. Some of these teams are not being. I wouldn't say that Pakistan is conservative with the ball. Right? I wouldn't say that Sri Lanka is conservative with the ball either. In fact, Sri Lanka has been a team over the last couple of years who's been quite attacking in T20 cricket. It's just that they can't keep anyone at the crease, a bit like the West Indies. So I don't think it's a case of the Asian teams are conservative and the Western teams are aggressive, because, there's plenty of anchors in some of those other teams. I would say that if you look at the South African batting lineup, there's not as much dynamism there as there could be. And certainly part of that is because at number 7 is a guy who can't really bat, right? So it's hard for them to push particularly hard. So I think there's a few teams like that. MJ Robinson said the only venue change that would make sense is the other Melbourne stadium that has a roof but doesn't have a cricket pitch at the moment. Not even sure it has an outfield. It definitely doesn't have a pitch. They're definitely doing work. This is the Docklands that MJ is talking about there. I think there might have been some other comments that I saw there where people were talking about, moving it to another venue. I'm not sure that there was a flexibility available. You've got to remember, you've got, let's say, 40,000 fans traveling to the MCG for the final from other places. People from within Australia who wanted to come to the final, probably, Pakistan fans, probably Indian fans who bought tickets, a few English fans on tours and everything else. How do you deal with all those people to move it to another city, right? On top of that, it's just the sheer, when would they have had to have made that decision? It wasn't actually raining all week in Melbourne, but there was scheduled rain, and it still may not affect the game. And so what happens if they moved it to somewhere else that wasn't scheduled to have rain? It does have rain and Melbourne doesn't, right? There's no way of winning this sort of thing. It's just been a terrible tournament as far as running into, this El Niños event. And that could happen anywhere. Australia, the South Australia is not particularly a tropical climate, but places like Australia, Sri Lanka, I'm trying to think anywhere else in cricket. They do have tropical storms that can last for days and can really affect things and come almost from nowhere and all those sorts of things. At a certain point, I don't know what you're going to do that. We play cricket all around the world, and in some places it rains, and in very few places it doesn't. That's how things happen. I was at Eden Gardens in 2016 when the initial weather reports there said that the India-Pakistan game would be washed out. I mean, they ended up getting almost a full game. I think maybe it was a full game there. But I remember BBC saying to me, Jarrod, can you be on standby because we might need to fill in this whole game. We're being told it's going to be washed out. And all the local journalists telling me, yeah, we won't get any play. These things happen. It is what it is, and it's part of our game. Tom says, what are your thoughts on the World Cup expansion and the new format? Are you glad to see all the teams starting in the same route? That's the most important thing, I think, for me, Tom. You can't have a World Cup and have a two-tiered competition. It's not what a World Cup is. It's, making teams re-qualify for a tournament they have technically already qualified for is just stupid. Then making the commentators pretend that the tournament has started when everyone knows it hasn't, and then they slip up and they look like idiots for saying the truth. It's just idiocy. We shouldn't be starting a tournament, with all due respect to the great city of Geelong and the great cricket teams of Namibia and Sri Lanka. We shouldn't be starting a World Cup in Australia in Geelong with Sri Lanka and Namibia when everyone knows the actual tournament starts a week later. It's classic ICC bullshit, right? And it doesn't make any sense. And they've got to... Things like that are just unnecessary. This has been a fucking fantastic tournament, right? And we have seen Namibia, Netherlands, Zimbabwe, Ireland, Scotland, all beat test-playing nations. We saw the UAE, who's the weakest team in this tournament, beat Namibia. It's been an absolutely fantastic tournament from that perspective. And there's, any World Cup in the world, I watch Basketball World Cup, and I watch some of these teams get beaten by 50 points by, America and the French, right? And Australia scoring 100 points and some, poor European team getting to 65 points or something, right? It happens all the time. That happens at a World Cup. It happens at a football World Cup, right? You still get those mismatches, and football is a far more competitive game, and football and basketball far more competitive game than cricket. This whole idea that every game needs to be competitive, you can't gerrymander that, right? You can't. And also the other thing is that I think this World Cup will last in our memory a little bit longer just because of the random nature of everything that has happened, right? There is the 92 World Cup is considered the best one-day World Cup by a lot of people. You go back through it and it was really, really good. And there are a lot of teams at a similar level, partly because no one had taken one-day cricket that seriously. And you had a couple of teams trying new things, and Australia with their method they were just starting to perfect, and then Zimbabwe, Pakistan come from nowhere. There was a couple of things. There's a lot of shit games that no one will ever remember, a lot of which played in fucking rural places around Australia because they knew that the crowds weren't going to come to them if they put them in major cities, right? We've got to get beyond that whole nonsense thinking. I haven't done a huge deep dive on the new tournament structure yet, Tom. But I think I don't think cricket has ever been stronger when you look at the top 16 teams in the world. And if that's the case, I think that's where we need to get to, and we need to keep growing and keep developing. Babs says, one has to admit, though, that barring the Zimbabwe, Pakistan has been exceptional this World Cup. Lost to India, which they should have won. Thrashed South Africa, Netherlands. See, the Netherlands game, as I said, I thought they batted shit in that game. I thought they looked absolutely terrible in that game. Bangladesh, yeah, they did fine. South Africa, they certainly did fine. And New Zealand, they did good. Momentum. Well, obviously that's nonsense, Babs, but that's a different thing. So I think it depends on how you look at these things, because there's two ways of looking at that first game against India. They took a bunch of wickets early on and then allowed the opposition to score absolutely freely. They lost a bunch of wickets. Their top order, which has been their strength, hasn't been doing very well. Shadab Khan has probably patched over a lot of their problems by having such a great tournament so far, probably on both sides of the ball. So from that perspective, I'm not sure their entire team is firing. And if you were looking at that record and you were telling me that everyone was playing their role in every single game, and the squad that they had assembled was still firing and was going the direction that you wanted it to, I'd be on your side. But Mohammad Wasim is here by accident. Shadab Khan has had to do far more work than they probably expected him to be able to do, especially from some of the positions they've been in. And their opening batting turned up very, very late. And their middle order has still shown patchiness in a couple of those games at times as well. So, look, they're in the final. And as I said, I look at it over the full 10 games, or 12 games, whatever it would be. 13 games? How many would they have played? They played a lot of games over the two tournaments for them and England. And I've got no problems with saying that those two have probably been the best teams, all things considered, with, probably Australia and New Zealand just behind them, India and South Africa just a slight setback. But all six of the major teams have actually, looked like they could win the World Cup at various different times and, had things fallen in different ways. But I think it would have annoyed me if Pakistan and England hadn't made the final, just from a perspective of they both had, in England's case, they maybe a bad 4 overs with 4 or 5 injuries in the last game against New Zealand. And in Pakistan's case, basically going within a field of being slightly in the wrong position of going through that final. So it doesn't mean that I expected them to win or anything like that. But, you should be, if you're looking at this more as a league, which is the way I've been covering it, it would have been a bit silly if neither of them had made the final. Going deep says, I've got 99 problems, but hearing Jarrod's seductive voice ain't one. Seductive. Well, look at his photo. He's all in. I actually only picked this question because he said I had a seductive voice, not because I wanted to talk about 99.94's great new podcast that you go listen to. Honestly, some absolute stunning episodes have come out recently towards the end of this World Cup. The West Indies rebuilding one is fascinating. Lungani going nuts on the South Africa one. India and England did very well. And also, you know, the talking about the nonsense around from Sri Lankan WhatsApp over the charges against Ganathalaka is really interesting as well. All right. Asfan says, why is Pakistan's 2009 T20 World Cup win so under the radar? Everyone keeps reminiscing about the 92 World Cup victory and the 2017 Champions Trophy win. Not many remember the 2009 win with the same nostalgia because it was early T20. I mean, if you have a look at it, England's win is not particularly pushed up. The only one that's really pushed up is India's. And I would say that is mostly just pushed up because it was literally the first one and because it was the main catalyst for the IPL and everything that followed. But the Pakistan and the England one, how long did Pakistan hold that trophy for? Was it 10 months? It wasn't long. I mean, the next tournament, it might have been 9 months. It was probably longer than that. It felt like about a week they had that tournament for, and then England was winning. You know, it should be a much bigger storyline that England beat Australia in a World Cup final. And I reckon if you did a trivia question with most cricket fans, I think most cricket fans would say they never remember. They never remember England playing Australia in a World Cup final, let alone losing in that particular one anyway. Although it's happened twice, I suppose. But let alone Australia losing, I should say, and England losing the other one. But yeah, I think that's the main reason why it didn't happen. Also, T20 cricket, to be fair to all those teams, I would say that until 2012, we didn't really have an idea of what cricket was. Well, maybe cricket was. T20 cricket was. And so I think because of that, it wasn't given the same credit. For me, it felt like 2012 was the first time. And even 2012 is really like on the borderline. And even 2014, maybe slightly on the borderline of just people starting to, oh, wait a minute. You know, and I'm talking about the people who didn't commit to it early on. And so I do think, you know, it's like going back and having a look at some of those early World Cups, even India in 83, you know, and West Indies in 79 and 75, and Australia in 87. Those ones aren't talked about the same as from 92. And 92 is the first time that one day cricket really starts to be taken seriously. That's an important moment in it. And if you go back, 2012, 2014, but certainly 2016 is the first time that T20 cricket is really taken seriously. And so I do think that there is a difference there. But yeah, I think there are a lot of things counting against that particular memory from cricket fans. Gautam says, Imad Wasim or Mohammad Nawaz? I think Imad Wasim at his best was a better player. I would have to go and look at their recent records. I think Imad Wasim was a very fascinating player, but he also is a very... Outside of Asia, I can see why Pakistan maybe didn't want him as much. And I don't mean that he can't bowl outside of Asia, but what I do mean is that with Imad Wasim, you probably want him to be your bowler in the power play. If you're coming to Australia and you're going to fit 4 seamers into your team, you're going to need to bowl a lot of them in the power play. And I don't know if Imad Wasim is suited to that. Mohammad Nawaz also, with Shadab Khan batting in the top 7, and Mohammad Nawaz batting in around, you know, where's he been batting? 7, I suppose. It has given them a little bit more flexibility to use him or not use him, especially if they've got Iftikhar as well. So from that perspective, they probably think that Mohammad Nawaz is the stronger batter, and I would say that is true, I think. I don't think there's that much in it, but I certainly think that's probably true, certainly at this stage of Imad Wasim's career. But I'd have to do a deeper dive to have a look at that. But how good is Imad Wasim's medium pace? Although I suppose he kind of bowls medium pace in the power play sometimes. Anyway, that's for another time. And last one from T20 Geek says, what's the most difficult phase to bat in T20s? Most difficult phase, it depends on how you look at it. The most difficult phase to bat, the most difficult position to bat in is number 4 generally. Number 4 usually comes in between overs was it 5 and 8 or something? And so because of that, you're coming in at the end of the power play, but you're not set, so it's hard for you to attack. And if you lose another wicket, you could set off a bit of a collapse. And then you're quite often coming in and you're facing the spinner with the field out straight away, which is a different kind of challenge altogether. Usually the opposition's best spinner as well is bowling, around that early period. So that's the hardest position to bat in the batting order. And then I would say the hardest actual position to bat is probably the person who comes in between the 12th and 16th over, because your job is to score quite quickly, but if you lose a wicket, then things can change the dimensions of the rest of the innings. The ball is now completely soft, and you can't rotate strike without putting pressure on the guy at the other end and the scoreboard altogether. And all the fielders are out. Whereas if you come in earlier in the middle, while the middle is different, you can knock yourself to 6 off 6 in the middle without anyone really caring that much. But if you come in on the 13th or 14th over and you're 6 from 6, you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself to catch up very, very quickly. And as I said, the ball is a little bit softer by that point, and probably, depending on the grounds, but more often than not in most T20 grounds in the world, the bowlers have started to bowl the majority of their slower balls. So it means you're facing spinners at the end, and you've just come to the crease, and they've been bowling for a while, and they understand the pitch and the ground dimensions quite well. And you're facing pace bowlers who are bowling, who are really mixing up their pace, which again makes it harder for you to strike well straight away. Best player is probably Andre Russell for that particular role, but he can also come in the 7th over and also be the best player, depending on if you want to risk the fact that he might go out to the spinners early on. But if he comes off, he'll win the game for you in that period. But yeah, Andre Russell is probably traditionally the best one. I suppose AB de Villiers was another player who was very good at that. Joss Buttler, before he moved up the order, would be the other one off the top of my head. And I suppose of his form recently, you would have to put David Miller there, and Kieran Pollard would be the other obvious choice for that period. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. We will come back tomorrow, and hopefully we'll be doing a review of the World Cup final, but perhaps not. And if we're not doing a review of the World Cup final, we'll come back tomorrow and we'll do a preview of the World Cup final. But either way, I'll speak to you again then. Thanks for coming on.